being secretive about family dysfunction is certainly not exclusive to the Ramseys. I just want to call that out, even if that might be ridiculously obvious. Hey y'all, welcome back to Ramblin' Mama. I'm Lisa, and this is the third part of the JonBenet series. If you haven't already, please go back and take a look at videos 1 and 2. In video 1, I give a broad overview of the timeline of events and the evidence that was found on the scene. And in video 2, we take a look at John and Patsy in terms of motives and evidence that points to them. Thank you all so much for giving me all the love on the first 2 videos. I really appreciate it. Please also like and subscribe so you can get the next video. The next one's gonna go over intruder theories, and if that gets too long, then I'll include also a 5th video where it takes a look at the DNA and how the DNA might not be as straightforward as we think it is. In today's video, we are gonna take a look at Burke, and I think it's important to say I am in no way a professional. There are a lot of professionals' opinions that I draw on in this video. Something that is very tricky about Burke is it appears that he perhaps is on the spectrum, and I think that complicates reading his behavior. I'm going to include some opinions from the behavior panel, and if y'all haven't already checked them out, you have to. They're one of my favorite channels on YouTube. I'll link them in the description below, and I trust them a lot more to give an accurate opinion of translating Burke's behavior. Something that they stress on there a lot, especially Greg Hartley, is he's always talking about baseline. I'm gonna add the clip in here of what Greg says about Burke's baseline.
Yeah, so for me, among the best parts of this entire interview is the fact that Dr. Phil is asking questions that he has no reason to lie to, what we would call a control question, typically something that we can get a baseline for this guy. So we see his baseline. Now, I'm also going to tell you he's got a nervous, weird smile. There are 2 things I'll say about that. It's only nervous and weird if you're not him. In his case, it's always there. Go look at pictures of him at his mother's funeral. Go look at pictures of him as a child. That smile is there. I was talking to my sister-in-law today. She had a great point, never even considered it. She said, do you think maybe he picked that up from being around all the pageant stuff? You know, all that fake smile. And his sister was always doing it. His mother was coaching, and he always saw it. Maybe he picked that up there. Don't know. Not speculating, but great call out by Lisa.
We can't expect the same behavior from Burke as we do from someone who is not neurodivergent. That's why I think what Greg Hartley talks about is important, his baseline. Burke has consistently, from the time of being a child to now, well into adulthood, shown that he had a tendency for a resting, smiling face, is what I think Greg calls it.
I think I told the story of the Navy SEAL, like all laughing boy, resting smile face, I guess is the way you'd put it, right? He just has a face that looks like he's smiling all the time. This guy is one of those people. So we're looking at what's a baseline for him. Remember, if you do something enough, it's normal for you. Humans form habits very quickly, and we all have something odd. It's just we're not all being asked if we killed someone. So we are not all under that kind of scrutiny.
While we may interpret it as very creepy that he's talking about these awful, traumatic events with a big smile on his face, if that is his baseline, that doesn't indicate guilt or any sinister motives. I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that context is always essential, especially when you're trying to do something as nearly impossible as understand what is going on in a person's mind. 2 big questions that come up when we start taking a look at Burke. The obvious question is, would he have been strong enough to cause a skull fracture like that was reported in the autopsy? It's possible that JonBenet could have woken up in the middle of the night. Burke might have been enjoying his favorite snack of milk and pineapple, and maybe there was a sibling scuffle that got out of hand. Maybe Burke had some particular feelings towards JonBenet of jealousy or resentment due to how much attention that she got in the family. Of course, there's no way to tell what the real family dynamics were like from the outside, but I think it is fair to speculate that beauty pageants can consume a lot of time, and given Patsy's enthusiasm for them, it could have been the case that JonBenet got perhaps a disproportionate amount of time also because she was younger. And John, being a busy CEO, might not have necessarily been there to provide as much parental support. And the big question is, if Burke did it, why would John and Patsy cover for their son? I think the obvious answer to that for me is one child has died, and the last thing you can imagine is the other child going to jail. Obviously, Burke was very young, and that would be taken into account. He would be charged as a juvenile, so he definitely wouldn't be going away for life. But that protective parental instinct to not lose your children just might have kicked in, and it might have inspired them to stage and cover up a scene. On this note, I want to say that in an interview that John and Patsy had just weeks after the murder, so it was still very fresh, the interviewer asked John if he thought his wife had committed the murder, would he turn Patsy in? And his answer to that was yes, without question. Your love for a child is unconditional. Your love for a spouse is conditional. I'm gonna insert here the reaction that Chase Hughes from the behavioral panel has to that.
I never saw this clip before until this morning, about 5:15 in the morning. And this single clip shot me out of my chair this morning when I watched it. I think this has the potential to illustrate the case. And let me walk you through my brain here for just a moment, if you'll bear with me. He says, your love for a child. So he says you're socializing everything because he wants you to understand his decisions. Love for a child is unconditional. And he does not say my love for JonBenet or my love for my child or my love for my daughter. Love for a child in general. So one question I repeatedly ask during every interview, especially ones like this, very calculatedly, what issue is being covertly socialized? So he's only deviating from baseline, which is talking about himself and Patsy, and shifting to using the word you to subconsciously socialize something to you. The video ends with him saying, I would do anything to protect my children, plural. And if I had made a decision to protect a different child, and I was fiercely defending that, that might explain the anger that you are just describing there at the end of that clip, Mark.
What do y'all think about that? Does that seem convincing that perhaps John could get behind the congruency of his behavior in that answer because he was thinking about Burke's best interests and protecting Burke at all costs? What do you think about that? On a more superficial level, from a family PR perspective, for lack of a better term, for a family that valued appearances so highly, you have the ex-beauty pageant queen who's now the beauty pageant stage mom, and you have the CEO of a large company that is a prestigious, well-groomed, good-looking family with a sterling image. They might have just been scrambling to cover up such a heinous act. When we learn about Burke's scatolia and JonBenet's bedwetting, this is something that really doesn't fit with the image of that family, and yet that is what was going on. I think that they might have been well practiced in hiding all of those flaws and family secrets. And look, let's be real. Every family has secrets. Every family has flaws. I think for the most part, people have an instinct to hide what's going on in their families. That's why there's all those sayings about what happens behind closed doors, and if these walls could talk. Being secretive about family dysfunction is certainly not exclusive to the Ramseys. I just want to call that out there, even if that might be ridiculously obvious. One incident that points to Burke having some kind of history with striking his sister is the incident with the golf club. And if you remember, I spoke about that in the first video. Again, if you haven't seen that, go back. But it was bad enough that Patsy and John were seeking out the advice of a plastic surgeon. One possibility, again, not saying that I necessarily think this is the most probable, let's say that Burke did strike JonBenet and she was passed out and her breathing was labored. Perhaps at that point, her parents already thought that she had passed and they went about staging the scene, and once they placed the garrote on her, perhaps she came to, and that's where the fingernail marks came from. That's very, very dark to think of, and I don't necessarily think that is the most probable explanation, but it's one theory regarding Burke being the perpetrator. In 2016, CBS ran a documentary that was called The Case of JonBenet Ramsey. And this documentary featured a panel of experts who lay out the scenarios that they believe occurred the night that JonBenet was murdered. So this is the scenario that they laid out. The night of the incident, Burke was eating pineapple and milk and drinking tea after playing with his toy. They think JonBenet ran by, grabbed a piece of Burke's pineapple, and out of anger, he hit her with the flashlight. JonBenet's stomach contents and the bowl on the kitchen table contributed to that theory, right? Because in the autopsy, I'll put the quote, as one commenter pointed out in one of the last videos, I have to say that the autopsy did not conclusively state that it was pineapple. They said what appeared to be pineapple. So this theory would account for that though. It accounts for the pineapple, it accounts for the skull fracture. So the panelists do not believe that Burke intentionally killed JonBenet, but they were unanimous in stating that the parents took over and fabricated a fake kidnapping story as a cover-up. The show included an interview with a former neighbor who stated that Burke had a temper. How much of a temper? Who knows? Because there's a difference, right, between having a temper and being homicidal. There was a flashlight found on the kitchen counter, and there was a drawer where John typically left a flashlight that was open with no flashlight inside. The Ramseys first said they recognized the flashlight on the counter, but they said it wasn't theirs. If it wasn't their flashlight, how did it get there? And why was the drawer where John kept his flashlight open? And this is one of those super strange things, just like the pineapple, where the pineapple was out and there were fingerprints on it that belonged to Burke and Patsy, and yet no one would claim the pineapple belonged to them. The same goes for the flashlight. They have a flashlight like that. It usually goes in a drawer. The drawer is open, the flashlight is gone, and yet that is not their flashlight. Strange stuff. But if you're a family who's trying to point to an intruder who knows the inner workings of your family, they know John's Christmas bonus, they know that he's from the South, they know where their pen and paper is apparently, and they know where their flashlight is. So I guess that could be the angle that you're playing, but it seems super unlikely. It's important to note that the size of this flashlight that was found fits the size of the skull fracture on JonBenet, but there was no DNA or fingerprints found on the flashlight. Dr. Werner Spitz actually ran this really creepy test where he used a child's cadaver and with that flashlight to compare the size and the shape of the skull fracture to see if it matched the fracture that was found on JonBenet. He said the results were consistent with the flashlight, meaning it could have been what caused it, but he said it also could have been caused by other things. So that sounds not entirely conclusive to me. So this panel on CBS were very outspoken in stating that they believed that Burke did it. They also believed that Patsy wrote the 3-page long ransom note that was found in the home. And in the autopsy, it reported these little marks that were found on JonBenet's back. They believed that that could have come from a piece of track on Burke's railroad set. Rather than being stun gun marks, they thought maybe it was Burke using his railroad set to perhaps revive JonBenet after he issued that blow to her head. 13 days after JonBenet's murder, Burke was interviewed by a child psychologist, and his behavior seemed strange. For instance, when the psychologist asked if Burke had anything to tell her, he said if he did have anything to tell her, he wouldn't. Burke's behavior when talking to this psychologist was very calm and relaxed. And when the doctor asked how things were at home, Burke said his parents were crying a lot, but he was moving on with his life. This is very strange, and it doesn't sound to me like typical 9-year-old talk. To me, this sounds like something he might have heard from his parents or family or friends of his parents, but also less than 2 weeks after the murder, I feel like 13 days after a breakup, you say something like, it sucks, but I'm gonna move on with my life. 13 days after the brutal murder of a little 6-year-old girl, I don't know who was saying that around Burke, that he repeated it, and to give that person or people the benefit of the doubt, maybe that was some kind of anchor to hold on to cope, but that really doesn't seem appropriate. And the psychologist asked Burke what he thought happened to his sister. Burke said he knows what happened. He told the psychologist that he asked his dad, where did they find JonBenet's body? His dad said they found her in the basement, and Burke believed that somebody hit her with a hammer. I think he said hit her with a knife or a hammer. I think on the behavioral panel, they called out that, I think it was Mark Bowden called out that the movement that he used to demonstrate how JonBenet may have been hit was the same with the knife as it was with the hammer, or whatever 2 weapons he gave as examples. And what Mark said about this, and I tend to agree, is that it's a very non-specific, childlike, here's the thing, and people hit like that. And from that, you could possibly draw the conclusion that Burke didn't issue that blow to her head, because that certainly wouldn't be an effective motion to cause that level of damage. So this part makes me really sad. When the child psychologist asked Burke to draw his family, he drew in the picture his mom, his dad, and himself. And he didn't include JonBenet. Everyone grieves differently, and no one can ever know how they would act in such an extreme life event unless they've been in that event themselves. But all of this feels so rushed. 13 days later, you're moving on with your life. Here's your family now. It's just the 3 of you. That stuff doesn't sit right with me. But what do y'all think? Am I reading too much into it? Do you feel the same way? So y'all let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think Burke did it? If so, do you think Patsy and John covered up for him? And if so, why did they cover up for him? Were they worried about losing their entire family in one fell swoop? It seems to me, from what I've seen, that people tend to point the finger at Burke. And I think that could have to do with his seemingly odd behavior. But once you put it into context of what his baseline is, I think it's hard to deduce guilt from that kind of behavior. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks, y'all, and I'll see you next time.